Imagine a time when people lived in these remote mountains year-round. Imagine the brutality of those times, when survival meant building fortified towers in near inaccessible places. Imagine their resilience, their unyielding spirit, allowing them to endure here, living in small, tight-knit groups, constantly facing the threat of sudden, treacherous raids that brought pillage, violence, and often death. Yet, these shepherds and warriors remained, for centuries aligned their lives with the rhythm of nature and the ever-present need to defend themselves from northern invasions. Each family had its own tower, sometimes more than one, built to withstand sieges for days. Narrow entrances placed above ground, tall, thick walls, and clever interflow passageways made them nearly impregnable fortresses. Today, after centuries of turbulent history, only ruins remain, silent reminders of a harsher past and the lives lived within those stone walls. We are now in Girevi, located in Georgia's Kakheti region within the Akhmeta municipality, part of the historic Pirikita community. It lies about 50 kilometers from Omalo on the left bank of the Pirikita-Alazani River. Historically, Girevi was home to several Tush families until it was abandoned during the Soviet-era purges. North of Girevi, there are no more villages, only mountain passes, wild valleys, and fading traces of ancient shepherds' trails leading toward the Russian border, just a few kilometers away in a straight line. For those who venture this far, Girevi is the last point of contact with civilization, a quiet post before the journey continues into the true untamed wilderness of the Caucasus Mountains. After a slow, quiet morning, I begin to journey back. Since there's only one road leading to Girevi, I retrace the same route you saw in episode 8. The path winding along the Pirikita-Alazani River, crossing vast, sometimes flat slopes where sheep graze freely. At times, the track is compacted by passing vehicles, at others it's flooded with streams flowing down from the hillsides. For 90% of time, one might wonder if Girevi would be reached in an ordinary car, but all it takes is one stretch of rough terrain to shift that perspective and remind you just how untamed this land really is. Then it's back into the forest, a few gentle climbs, a glance at wild horses riding freely, and soon the cliffside before Omalo, where I also stopped back in 2015. Even in just a few shots, it's easy to see how strategically positioned Omalo is. Nestled on a natural plateau between the Pirikita and Gometsari-Alazani river valleys, it served as a perfect lookout and defensive point. Surrounded on all sides by steep slopes and high mountains, the terrain made access difficult and gave defenders the upper hand. Thanks to this geography, Omalo could fulfill the role of administrative, military, and pastoral center of the entire region for centuries. Back in 2015, the entire landscape reassembled a vast, seething cauldron. Steamy exhalations from the mountain slopes settled on the treetops, and the whole scene seemed to pulse with the cold breath of Mother Earth. Then I fly over the area once more on a bit of a search mission. The day before, I had agreed with Coco Vintage Overland that they would wait for me and we would head back together. But from above, I couldn't spot them anywhere. With no signal in the area, I decided after some 30 minutes to move on. Not long after, I came across this German off-road camper and I couldn't resist asking how a vehicle of that size handled those mountain switchbacks.
Hello! Big truck for this road. How was it on the serpentines? Scary. But you made it, good. Yeah, I can imagine. Going to Omalo, Narklo, Iveri, yeah. I spent the night in Iveri. Here's Paz.
On the right, we passed the clearing where Coco Vintage Overland and I had camped the night before. Soon after, I enter a particularly rocky stretch of road, one we had driven through in the darkness the previous evening, unable to truly grasp its rugged beauty. I just remember the car rocking side to side and now I understand why. As you can see, this landslide area is still active, so extra caution is needed here. I hadn't noticed how beautifully the Hisos River spreads out here either. It was pitch black when we passed by before, but just look at the turquoise water, it's genuinely spectacular. I couldn't help but think that in times of high water, this section of the gravel road must be completely submerged, making the area totally impassable. As I drove on, admiring the wild scenery, I suddenly spotted a familiar silhouette in the distance. Yep, it was Hans and Claudia's Toyota. It crossed my mind that they might have run out of fuel. The day before, we had agreed I'd shed some of mine, since Hans was caught off guard by the nature of the road. 70 kilometers of tough terrain and hadn't filled up beforehand. Luckily, I had. But as I got closer, I saw Hans staring into his drone controller. Turns out, they had simply stopped to grab a few shots from the air. Only, the flight ended somewhere in the trees on the right, and Hans was not trying to pinpoint the crash site.
And I was looking for you at the top.
I learned all this from Claudia. I told her I had searched for them up top, while they had actually tried to contact me via Instagram. But since I only had a fleeting moment of signal back at the bar in Pasma, I never got the messages. So they bought fuel from the local and started heading back, unsure of what had happened to me. Hans decided to squeeze in one more drone flight and, well, you know the rest. Unfortunately, unlike my drone mishap, Hans wasn't able to recover his. It had landed high on a rocky slope, well out of reach. Thankfully, it was still connected to the controller, so Hans quickly began transferring as much footage as he could to his phone before the battery gave out. Meanwhile, I set off once more towards Abano Pass. At one point, the weather started to take a turn. The rain began to fall, and I started to worry whether I'd be able to show the pass from the drone's perspective. I was relieved I had managed to bring it back into flying conditions, and not being able to launch it here would have been a real shame. Uncertain of what the weather might do, I decided to film part of the segment using the 360 camera, but it completely failed to capture the atmosphere of this place. So, focused on driving, I hoping that at the pass where two weather fronts often collide, the dry one would prevail, allowing me to fly. As you can see, despite it being July, patches of snow still lingered here and there, which certainly added charm to the landscape, but also served as a reminder that conditions here remain harsh for most of the year and should temper any temptation toward reckless driving. A sudden frost, bald tires, faulty brakes, too much speed, the boldness of drinking and driving, a moment's distraction, risky overtaking, and the result is what you can see here. There are quite a few of those roadside memorials along this route, and it seems every year claims lives of those who choose to travel this way. This road, the one that crosses Abano Pass, the highest drivable mountain pass in Georgia, is one of the most spectacular off-road routes in all of Europe. For overlanding enthusiasts, it's a true mecca, a symbol of adventure that transports you not just across space but through time. Every curve of the Serpentine Trail, winding across the green slopes of the Caucasus, feels like a gateway into another world. The world of Tusheti, a region that remains almost entirely cut off from civilization for most of the year. This narrow strip of gravel and stones leads you through a land that is wild, untamed and raw. There is no alternative route, no second road, no train, no airstrip, no plan B. If you want to reach Tusheti by vehicle, this is the only way in. And that's precisely what makes the journey itself a kind of a rite of a passage, a test of courage, humility before nature, and deep respect for the mountains. It offers just about everything travelers seek on a true expedition. Extreme switchbacks and exposed cliffside drop-offs, rapidly changing weather that can transform the landscape within minutes, evidence of landslides and cascading streams that cut across the path, breathtaking views that linger long after the journey ends, and the realization that you're not just heading to a destination, but into one of the most authentic and inaccessible corners of Europe. For those who take on the road to Abano Pass, the road itself becomes the destination. And that's exactly what makes it so extraordinary. And just like that, my adventure on this epic road was coming to an end. Well, maybe not right at this spot, but the most jaw-dropping views were already behind me. What remained were the winding switchbacks, the same ones where I almost lost my drone while heading to Omalo. A quick pass by the waterfall and the final stretch definitely more civilized of one of Europe's most dangerous roads. As I rolled up to the waterfall, I ran into Coco Vintage Overland once again. They had stopped to refill their water supplies. A good idea, and one I quickly decided to copy. I went for a slightly more subtle approach though, just stepping into the stream with a small water bag instead of, driving the whole car into it. After a few minutes of refueling and taking it all in, I set off once again, only to pull over just a few dozen meters later. 26-year-old Tsar, 48-year-old Tamas, 69-year-old Natella, 35-year-old Shota, 50-year-old Shalva and his two children, 13-year-old Garsevan and 18-year-old Levan, all lost their lives on this road on July 27, 2019. A Kamaz truck carrying 12 people plunged into a 150-meter deep gore near this very waterfall. 2 passengers managed to jump out before the vehicle fell. 3 others jumped out during the fall and sustained only minor injuries. The likely cause was a technical failure of the vehicle. The driver had previously spent 5 years transporting tourists to Tusheti in a Toyota 4x4. This is just one example of the many accidents that have occurred along this route. I talk more about this in earlier episodes, both in the 2D series and in Immersive Georgia. While some factors like alcohol or reckless driving can be avoided, others like sudden weather changes, landslide or avalanches simply cannot. That's why it's crucial to always approach this road with caution and respect. Yes, after covering nearly 150 kilometers of one of the most challenging roads in Europe, I was greeted by the rather unsettling grinding noise. This time, it sounded serious. Traveling solo made it hard to pinpoint where exactly the sound was coming from. After all, it's not easy to drive and walk alongside the car at the same time, so I decided to use a camera to inspect whether the issue was with the transfer case or the rear differential. It seemed to be the differential. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. Completely silent after just a few dozen meters, like it had never happened. Was it a good sign? Hard to say. Reason would suggest taking everything apart and checking thoroughly, but being thousands of kilometers from home, with no access to spare parts and limited time, I decided to take a chance and press on. My next destination, Vashlovani National Park. I was determined to return, especially to my favorite place on Earth, but more on that in the next part. Meanwhile, I arrived in the vicinity of Gurzani, one of the centers of Georgia's wine industry. It's a fairly developed area, which made it difficult to find a secluded place to spend the night. So I made use of a stream bed I came across while driving through the local fields and turned off the dirt road, just far enough to find a quiet spot to set up camp for the night. The landscape I woke up to that morning was entirely different from what I had grown used to over the past several days. This was a world where nature had clearly been tamed, shaped and ordered by human hands. Everything within sight bore the marks of human presence and dominance. Vineyards stretched nearly to the horizon, laid out in a tapestry of geometric patterns. A mosaic of rectangular plots, scarred like carefully placed tiles, filled the flat plains of Kakheti, glowing in shades from deep green to almost yellow. In the distance, the gentle silhouettes of the Caucasus Mountains frame the horizon. Through this fertile region flows the Alazani River, irrigating the vineyards and enticing with its sandy banks. The place may look peaceful now, but the previous evening, a farmer was tilling their field around those trees with a tractor, kicking up thick clouds of dust and making a deafening racket. I'll admit I cursed him silently at the time, desperate for some rest. But at the same time, I completely understood why he was doing it at that hour. Once the sun sets, the temperature drops just enough to make the work bearable. It's simply a better time for both man and machine. Even more, evening plowing helps preserve soil moisture. The sun no longer dries out the freshly turned earth, and the rising night air brings dew instead. To my surprise, we even had a little moment of connection, despite the language barrier. The farmer brought me a peach. I gave him a small bottle of vodka in return, and a few minutes later, he returned with a full sack of juicy peaches. After a peaceful, restorative night, I set off just before 9 a.m. on the final leg of my journey through Georgia. I'm heading southeast towards Vashlovani National Park. I don't linger in the Gruzani region. Sure, one could spend more time here, exploring local vineyards and testing the region's renewed wines, but that's not the kind of activity I'm seeking right now, so I leave it behind. Georgia may not be a vast country, but to truly experience it, you would need about 2 months, not the 2 weeks I've had. So compromises are inevitable. Some places you simply have to let go. In my memory, Vashlovani Park holds a very special place. Its tranquility and remoteness from civilization were exactly what I needed back then.
Let's be gone together. Let's hold hands into the sun. Let's be gone forever. Whether I'm right or wrong, we'll be gone. Whether I'm right or wrong, we'll be gone.
The drive to Vashlovani National Park Visitor Center takes me just over 2 hours. It's only about 66 kilometers from where I spent the night, but the start included a few dirt tracks, then a stop to refill drinking water at the public well, refuel and drive a long road with surprisingly heavy traffic. At last, compared to what I've gotten used to over the past few days, so it all took a bit more time. Visiting Vashlovani requires taking care of a few formalities before entering the park. First, because the area lies near the border, and second, because it's within a partially protected zone. The process begins at the Vashlovani National Park Administration Office in Dedoplitskaro. This can also be arranged by email in advance, but I did it in person. There, you provide your personal details, intended route, number of people, and vehicle information. After paying a small fee, you head to the border police station located about 2.5 kilometers from the park office in the same town, visible here. At the station, you present your identification, once again declare your vehicle and plan route, and wait for approval of your requested park entry period. Once those papers are in hand, you're free to venture into a completely different world, far from the mountain landscapes that had accompanied the journey so far. Initially, on the way toward the park, since this stretch isn't yet part of the national park, the road as straight as an arrow leads the way. It's the remnant of what was paved. Gradually, it gives way to gravel, but the number of bumps, potholes and patches where asphalt has long since vanished is so great that it's far more pleasant to follow the parallel rut track beside it, which runs along a field of golden grasses. That strip of grey ruts is surprisingly smooth and offers a welcome relief from the constant tension of dodging every new bump in the road. It even allows you to pick up a little speed and shave time of your journey, something that would be very risky on the broken asphalt beside it. But this respite doesn't last long. Before you know it, the field ends, and on the next expanse there are no trucks at all, some forced back on the main road, back to battling potholes. There's nothing around, literally nothing. Trees are exceptionally scarce, and the farther I go, the fewer I see. Ahead of the hood stretches a plain as flat as a tabletop, and the thermometer edges towards 40 Celsius degrees. With each kilometer, the popular attractions of Georgia fall farther behind me, and before me lies a virgin, seldom visited land greeting me with hot air and grass so dry it could spark with a single touch. This is exactly how I'd imagine a savanna. Some 40 kilometers past the park administration, I arrive at the village of Kurtskali. Just before it, my GPS tells me to turn south, but I miss the exact spot, follow some tire tracks across the field, and end up well off course. After finding the proper road again, I head southeast towards the Azerbaijani border. The track here is carved into the soft earth, again surprisingly even and a real pleasure to drive. The scenery grows more interesting, the terrain becomes varied, with gentle hills and occasional clusters of stunted shrubs carpeting their slopes. A few kilometers on, it gets even better. I find myself winding deeper between ever-narrowed hill drop in taller bushes and low trees. From above, those scraggly thickets might look insignificant and sparse, but from the driver's seat, they loom high enough to block the view and grow so densely that there's no chance but to stick to the single track forked by earlier vehicles. And before them, surely by people on foot or horsebacks. And the farther I go, the more often the road and the riverbed overlap, or rather, the now dry riverbed becomes the road, carrying me deeper into the park. How does it look from the passenger's perspective, head leaning out the window? See for yourself. This is exactly what driving through this area looked like. And you'll agree, it's hard to get lost here. There really aren't many chances to stray from the track. Sure, the tire marks sometimes split, but they soon rejoin and you end up right back in the same riverbed you briefly left. All of this happens to the soundtrack of thousands, if not millions, of crickets you probably heard in the background. And, of course, the relentless heat. If you read other people's accounts online, you'll sometimes find claims that this park can be explored in a standard car. Well, maybe if you're extremely cautious, conditions are dry and you stay strictly on the main route. It might be doable, but if your standard car is loaded to the roof, I wouldn't be so sure you would be able to reach all the places I did. Eventually, I reached one of the many checkpoints scattered throughout the park. Border guards check documents, radio others post to confirm you followed the declared route, and then wave us through. Sometimes they speak English, sometimes they don't, so communication can be a bit hit or miss.
Hello. Of course I got the papers and I want to use this.
Business Business
I speak English.
Ungalo.
This spot marks the southernmost corner of Vashlovani National Park. Here, we're driving right along the border with Azerbaijan, which follows the course of the Alazani River, an ancient waterway that separates the lands of those two countries. Despite the harsh, arid conditions characteristic of Vashlovani, the Alazani is a vital water source for the surrounding ecosystem. Along its banks, where the river's depth varies and natural meanders form, you'll find unique microhabitats. The Alazani riverbed is notable for its pronounced meandering. These sweeping curves, shaped by long-term erosion and sedimentation process, give the river a complex, undulating path. As a result, the surrounding landscape becomes more visually diverse. The river's natural arcs create picturesque scenes that appeal not only to tourists but also to researchers and nature enthusiasts. In some areas, the Alazani displays more complex geomorphological features, clearly defined natural terraces and secondary channels that occasionally give rise to small ponds or temporary lagoons. These features are the product of seasonal flooding and fluctuations in the river's flow. The views here combine the severity of a semi-desert landscape with the vitality of flowing water, making this a place of surprising charm and beauty. I came across a small hill at the spot where the road turned east, veering away from the river for a while. I decided to stop and capture a panorama, one that perfectly illustrates how the river itself draws the boundary between nations. Despite the surrounding semi-arid climate, the presence of water gives a landscape a sense of lightness. Bright greenery, framed by sandy hills, creates a surprisingly vibrant contrast. After hours of pushing through dry terrain, the scenery here brought a certain ease to my mind. It helped me forget, if only briefly, how inhospitable this region can be. But only briefly, because soon I was back in the car, heading south in the search for a good spot to camp for the night. The sun was already low, and as usual, I was trying to find a place before darkness fell. It wasn't exactly easy. The riverbank was covered in dense vegetation, and the bank itself was high and steep, which meant my hopes for an evening shower were dashed. Just take a look at the ground. Can you imagine what this place must be like after it rains? The soaked earth turns to thick mud that clings the tires, immediately clogging the tread and turning them into slicks with zero grip. For an overland vehicle, where weight is the biggest enemy, these conditions are a nightmare. That's why I'd be cautious about claims that this park can be driven through in a standard passenger car. Sure, if the weather is perfect, it might be possible, but if it rains, well, good luck. And once again, banging noises coming from underneath the car. Definitely not the sounds you want to hear, especially in a place like this, with such hill looming ahead. Just look at the surrounding vegetation. This area clearly must be underwater quite often. At that exact spot, it turned out that driving in second gear on the high-range gearbox, I couldn't make it up the hill. The car simply didn't have the power. I tried to start again after shifting into first, but the drivetrain started slipping again. Not wanting to push it too hard, I decided to back all the way down, engage first gear in low range, and tackle the hill that way. Honestly, I would have much preferred to rev the engine higher and attack the climb a bit more aggressively, but unfortunately, there was still near 4,000 kilometers between me and my home. This was no time or place to be thrashing the car or forcing the tires to claw their way up through brutal force. So slowly, like a snail, without putting too much strain on the drivetrain, I began crawling uphill, hoping that each new jolt and knock wouldn't turn out to be the final one.